I'm Kathryn Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your counsellor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hi everyone, welcome back to VLGA Connect and another edition of TGU, a special edition in fact, as elections fast approach. I want to thank our sponsors, Hunt and Hunt Lawyers, and bring in for a wide-ranging conversation about the council term that was, Kathryn Arndt, CEO of the VLGA. It's been a while, Kathryn. Welcome back to VLGA Connect.
Thanks, Chris. It has been a while. I've missed sitting here talking to you, so thanks for having me back.
Well, you're welcome anytime you want to come and talk. The door's open. And of course, well, it's your door. And Rhys Thomas is with us as well, the VLGA's head of local government programs and policy. Hello, Rhys.
Yeah, hey, Chris, it's good to be part of the main part of the program for once.
Yes, of course. Well, there's no insert today and no Rhys pun that I'm aware of that we need to get into the mix. But what we wanted to chat about today was things that have happened over the past 4 years, a reflection on the council term that was as we head towards a new one. And of course, the big thing that impacted this term, Kathryn, was the new Local Government Act, which was passed just a few months before the term commenced.
Absolutely. And that was after, I guess, an unsuccessful attempt to get it passed before the 2018 state election. So, you know, that it seemed like it was something that was getting talked about and consulted about and discussed for a long time. And I'm sure, you know, when it eventually did pass, I think it was around the 1st of March 2020, the then Executive Director of Local Government Victoria, Graham Emerson, must have sighed a big sigh of relief.
Yes, indeed. And of course, Rhys, you were working in a council in the governance space at the time. What was that period like? Because there were a lot of changes that governance officers had to get their heads around, weren't there?
There certainly were. And I mean, Kathryn's right in that 2018 effort got the sector starting to think about what reforms might be possible and what changes could be done. And, you know, I think despite the hiccup of the 2018 election, when it came around again in 2020 and the bill in 2019, there was a lot of optimism from governance officers about some real reform that could happen in the way that decisions got made, the way that communities were engaged, the way councillors could participate and work more constructively together. And there were a lot of plans in place to actually really rethink the way governance was delivered. But then, of course, in 2020, something significant happened in our world, which threw everyone kind of off the focus a little bit. So I think it was in some ways an opportunity missed because we were trying to keep the lights on in the 2020. And so all the excitement about writing new governance rules and other things kind of went out the window because me, like every other governance officer, was working from home and just trying to keep the council meetings legal and the organisation moving forward.
Before we head into talk about COVID and the impact that had on the sector, just reflecting back on that consultation of what became the 2020 Act, what it really demonstrated too was the importance of the sector and the peak bodies in particular. So the VLGA ran a lot of joint sessions where we spoke alongside LGV with councils and councillors about what you know, what the bill was going to contain, and what did the sector want there to be in there. And I think that partnership, that strong partnership between, you know, the peak bodies, which is what our role is as part of that Victorian State Local Government Agreement, really reinforced to me that the state government need to be working with the sector through its peaks on any significant reforms like that.
Yeah, so let's talk about COVID, seeing as you've introduced that dirty word into the conversation, Rhys. It did throw a lot of things up in the air for the way councils functioned. We saw, you know, a huge increase in the use of virtual solutions. Obviously, what did that mean in the governance environment?
Well, I mean, I suppose to start out with, and it was before the term that's just coming to an end, just before is. There were just some basic questions about it. Initially, virtual meetings weren't even legal. So there was a period of time when a whole lot of CEOs were given some pretty extraordinary emergency delegations, for example. And thankfully, that situation didn't last very long. But I think probably the biggest impact it had on term of council that's just coming to an end now was that lack of ability to come together as a group, physically come together as a group once the councils were elected. So the induction program, which I know the whole sector is really investing in right now, and the VLGA is out there talking to councils about how we can help them with that. But that induction program in 2020, it just, in many ways, it was very much a compliance exercise more than it was really about positioning teams for good governance. I mean, it wasn't a total disaster. Many councils did it really well. And in fact, the bulk of councils are operating really effectively, but it could have been better. And I think we learned a little bit that we can take forward into this upcoming induction.
And I think we saw the fatigue and perhaps the effect of that, sort of virtual induction, virtual team building environment really play out in the third year of the term, where councils were having to revisit some of those discussions about how they would work together as a group and get through that final year. Before we get into more of, I guess, that flow-on effect, one of the other things that was happening at the time, pretty early on in COVID, was a strong advocacy by some groups, and surprisingly, they were led by women who were really calling for the state government to defer the local government election because they felt that that would have, negative impacts for women being elected. And of course, we know that subsequently that turned out not to be true at all. In fact, women did very well in these elections. And, I think we had the highest percentage of women elected in any year, I think, from what I understand. And I'm really pleased to say that the VLGA also played a really big part in this. In 2019, we launched our Local Women Leading Change program, which was an updated version of our previous Go Women campaign, which focused on supporting women standing and getting elected in local government. And we launched that at a really awesome event in Kensington Town Hall. We had the Lord Mayor there, Professor Andrea Carson. Of course, it was also that first year of the Australian Research Council linkage project that the VLGA is part of, looking at the political trajectories of women. And the event closed with the fabulous Queenie singing a rendition of This Is Me from The Greatest Showman. Now, over 700 women were touched by that program in lead up to the 2020 elections. And of those who then went on to stand for election and run as candidates, over 200 women from our program, or who'd been touched from our program, were elected. So we're really pleased with that result.
Excellent. What else do you look back on the 4 years of the actual council term, Kathryn, as being significant for the VLGA and its work?
Yes, well, look, I mean, the virtual nature of operating allowed us to deliver, I guess, probably a lot more councillor induction programs in partnership with councils than we would have been able to do face-to-face. So that meant our reach was quite broad. Of course, ideally face-to-face is always stronger, particularly with those sorts of really important mandatory elements of induction, but also the team building stuff. We also, in lead up to those elections, so I guess it was predominantly a COVID environment, we also ran, I think, over 40 candidate training sessions. So, I mean, one of the things the VLGA has been talking about for a long time is the importance of really making sure that candidates are informed when they put their hand up to run in local government elections, but also voters too. So we were really pleased to get, people in front of a screen, at least hearing some of them for the first time about what the role of local government was, what are the responsibilities of a councillor, and then hopefully, even if they didn't go on to run, they were casting their votes in a more informed way.
Before we leave the implementation of the Local Government Act 2020 behind, I wonder how we feel, and Rhys, you might have a view on this. Remember, it was said that the aim was to be more principles-based than prescriptive, as perhaps the previous act had become. How do you score it on that sense?
Well, I scored an A for effort and something a little less for execution.
Right.
And I won't put a letter on it, but it was often talked about how heavily amended the 89 Act had been, and this was kind of thrown around as one of the reasons for change. Well, the 2020 Act lasted 2 weeks before the First Amendment. That was all it took. And I mean, there was a reason for it. The First Amendment was actually the thing that enabled those virtual council meetings, in fact. But I think what has been realised is that while there's a desire for principles-based legislation to let councils determine their own sort of destiny in many ways, if the sector doesn't have the resources required to do that, then it makes it very challenging. So it's all very well to say to every council, you can go and write your own governance rules, or you can go and write your own such and such policy. But if the organisation is affected by skill shortages, by the level of resources available to commit to those sorts of things, then of course it's going to look to organisations like us at the VLGA for, do you have model policies we could use? Do you have standard governance rules? Do you have all of those things? And in 2020, that was asked exactly the same. Every council had the opportunity to write their own governance rules. More than half of them bought an off-the-shelf product from a law firm, tinkered with it for their own needs and implemented it. It wasn't really a significant reform.
And there was a steering committee established where it was attempted, to do a lot of that work. But I think the complexity of the environment of COVID, the challenge of reconciling just how many different policies were out there across the sector. And I remember as part of that steering group, LGV undertook an exercise where they looked at the number of different state government policies, departments, rules and regulations that impacted the local government sector. And a spreadsheet was produced. I'm not sure where it's gone now, but it did have, I think, over 60 different parts of government that impact local government on a day-to-day basis. And it was actually, quite eye-opening, I think, for local government Victoria themselves, but also it just reinforced strongly to the sector and those around the table about that real need for resourcing, so that the sector can do the work that they're legislated to do and they've been asked to do.
All right, let's look at the term itself. I sort of think of it as the term where conduct issues really came to the fore, and not just at the councillor level, but also the way communities reacted with councils. That civility issue sort of became front and foremost. And of course, it sort of mirrors, doesn't it, what happened before the last term where we had the new legislation coming in. In this period, we've got new legislation to deal with some of those conduct issues that are going to take effect for the new term.
Yeah, we do. And look, I think we've learned, and when I say we, I mean the sector and the VLGA have learned a lot about how to support each other through a change process like that. And so I'm hoping that the execution of these legislative changes is perhaps a little bit more polished than it was in 2020. But you're right to comment on the issue of council conduct, but I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that there have always been a minority of councils and councillors who have crossed the line. You don't need to have the 2020 Act for that. That happened under the 1989 Act as well. And in fact, we came into the start of this term, there were three councils actually that didn't have an election in 2020. They were Whittlesea, Casey and South Gippsland. South Gippsland came on a bit later, and Whittlesea and Casey come on later this year. But so in some ways, it was the 2016-2020 term that saw 3 councils dismissed, whereas in fact, the term we're in now actually only saw 1 council dismissed and 1 suspended. There's a technical difference between them. But so however way you look at it, it's a very small minority of the councils. And Casey, the most famous example, because of course that led to Operation Sandon, which we can talk about. But even at Casey is 1 council out of 79, and the problem was caused by a small minority of councillors on that council. Not all the councillors should be tarred with the Operation Sandon findings. So yeah, it's an issue, but I'm not sure that it's the main issue. It's certainly the main issue for organisations like us to be thinking about, but I don't think members of the public should be thinking that there's something fundamentally wrong with local government.
You're being dangerously sensible there, and we shouldn't let facts get in the way of a good story, perhaps. But I put Moira to you as as a really extreme example of where action has been taken from the government to remove an entire council for a long period of time, as it's going to turn out. That's pretty unique, isn't it?
Yeah, look, it's not common, obviously, but it was really extreme circumstances at Moira, and I think by the time people realised what had happened, it was time to take action. And I kind of look at council governance sometimes a little bit akin to healthcare. And so we have these municipal monitors, and you can think of them as being like popping into your local GP. You've got a little niggle or something sort of slightly, not feeling quite right. So you pop in and you get some advice, and you visit your municipal monitor for as long as is required. But occasionally the municipal monitor needs to refer you off to the specialist, and you go and get some tests. And then sometimes, like happened at Moira, the scans come back and the news is not good and you need to go into surgery. So that's kind of what happened there. But it should be, if you look at it as a continuum like that, I think it's actually helpful to understand the role of municipal monitors now. They're not such a terrible punitive measure that perhaps they were at first. Now I think they're very much just a governance health check.
It's been a very proactive sort of step that the government has taken with the monitors, Kathryn, hasn't it? It's probably one of the hallmarks of the term.
Yeah, look, it is. And I think it's something that probably Strathbogie led at the time in really quite loudly calling for assistance and calling for a monitor to come into a council that I think all but one councillor at the time had served on council before. So, they really needed that GP to come in and, have a look and give them some assistance and then refer them on to some specialists. If I can use your analogy, Rhys, I didn't do it as articulately as you, but anyway, there we go. Can I say another thing which we forgot to mention about COVID? VLGA Connect was born out of COVID and has continued and grown since then. And that, I think, is just yet another example of, the VLGA being so agile and responsive to what the sector was desperately wanting. And that was a platform like this to hear, from thought leaders, from every commissioner, I think, Chris, we've probably spoken to, and, about what was happening in the sector. It was, we kept those lines of communication open, and it was really important and continues to be so.
I think that's right. And when you look back at the body of work that VLGA Connect has put out, you can. It's a microcosm, really, isn't it, of what happened? 3 different ministers have appeared. Local government ministers have appeared on VLGA Connect, because that's how many we've had in the time.
And we can't underestimate the impact that that's had on the sector as well. And also, even at a departmental level, some change at that leadership level at Local Government Victoria, and even where Local Government Victoria itself now sits in, the wheels of government.
We've seen a lot of arbiter reports, conduct reports, etc., that have been unpacked and discussed in various forums. One of the real themes to come out of those, I might ask you, Rhys, first about this, is the way social media has been used. And that's another thing that's really come to the fore in these conduct issues, isn't it?
Yeah, and look, social media is problematic in terms of public discourse. There's no doubt about that. It's not a fantastic platform in some ways. It's great in others. It reaches people perhaps that are not otherwise discussing the sorts of issues that councils want to discuss with their community. So that's good, but there's a downside to social media. It's pretty obvious what that is, and the fact that some councillors have felt the need to engage in behaviour that's falls short of the standards of conduct is disappointing. But that's part of the reforms. I don't know if the upcoming need for councils to adopt a council or social media policy. I don't think policies don't solve problems, but they help. They're a tool, and so that will be useful. But yeah, look, I say to candidates, and I've obviously finished all of the candidate information sessions now, but I've been saying to candidates, don't necessarily just wade straight into social media without really giving it some thought. It's a space that is useful for particular things, but don't feel obliged, and certainly don't put your well-being at risk by doom scrolling, I think is the term. That's not the best way to spend your Sunday evenings when you're preparing for another week of work.
True. And of course, an offshoot of this environment that's grown is councils having to deal with the safety implications, the responsibilities towards staff and councillors to be able to operate in a safe workplace. And we saw some councils close their meetings to the public for a time.
We did, and I think that goes back to your comment earlier, Chris, about civility and the expectations that, there's expectations of councillors and the way that they behave. But similarly, our citizens, our community members also need to be aware of what are their responsibilities when we're talking about civil discourse. It's okay to have a different opinion, but there is a way in which you progress that. And to turn up at council meetings where there are other community members present who just want to hear their elected representatives, make decisions on their behalf, and that's disrupted, and their safety is at risk is it's just really disappointing that we're seeing more and more of that.
It is, and it's yet to be seen how it plays out in this election campaign. I saw one sitting councillor who's running again out at Greater Dandenong has called on all of the candidates to sign an election pledge to make it a civil and respectful campaign, because some people, and I think the local government inspector, Michael Stefanovic, made some comments about this, said last election period was one of the most toxic and disrespectful campaigns that anybody had seen for quite some time, if not ever.
Yeah, I mean, and there's no doubt that electioneering is getting messy across the board, not just obviously in Victorian local government, but probably, I think it's less than a week after our local government election is the US presidential election, and we've obviously, anyone that turns on the TV or the internet knows that their elections are very different to ours and have been changing very significantly depending on the mood of the populace. It is a shame to see that happening more and more here. Maybe I'm naive and a little bit optimistic, but I like to think that when people sit down at their kitchen table and fill out that ballot paper, they do have the interests of the community in mind. But I don't know, maybe there's no evidence for that other than my pie in the sky wishes.
Well, look, I guess the opportunity that we've had in lead up to this election is that we have been out there working with many councils, and you in particular, Rhys, and also Genderlens Australia, who are delivering our local Women Leading Change program, out there delivering face-to-face education, candidate training, and reinforcing, that message that you just spoke to. So hopefully we'll have some candidates who put their hands up for exactly that reason, to, make decisions in the best interests of their community.
Don't want to dwell on this issue much more, but just to point out, there was a pretty significant stand taken not that long back now by the CEO of Greater Geelong Council, Ali Wasty, in court after some pretty horrific text messages were targeted at her and members of her staff. And it's just a bit of an indictment, isn't it, that those sort of steps need to be taken to draw a line in the sand when you'd hope people would be acting more reasonably than that.
Yeah, look, it is a shame, and I think that's one we know about. We saw Yarra Rangers have to make the regrettable decision to close their meetings to the public because of security concerns for the councillors and staff. And I know of a whole lot of organisations that have put things that perhaps haven't made the newspaper, but measures in place to protect staff and councillor safety. And things like removing the names of council officers from the reports that they include in agendas, for example. Or, I remember having to speak to a council officer at one point who really could not attend the council meeting and present the report they'd been working on because of the subject matter material and the safety considerations of being in that environment. You think that's a real shame that it comes to that, but council CEOs do have an obligation for workplace health and safety. And I've never met a CEO that doesn't take that extremely seriously. And so, in fact, one of the changes to the Act in the current reforms is to give the CEOs a little more power in relation to the health and safety for councillors, and that's going to be a positive thing, I think, too.
Absolutely.
Now, perhaps one more topic to discuss before we wrap up, and it's one that's been around for a while, but was really highlighted in many ways during this term, and that is the ongoing financial sustainability of the sector. Kathryn, some councils, some mayors in particular, have been taking a real leadership stance on this.
Yeah, look, they have, and I know Glen Ira led the way with that. They actually engaged a consultant to do a significant piece of work looking at cost shifting at their council. And I just can't recall the figures off the top of my head, but I mean, it was in the millions of dollars that they'd assessed had been shifted onto them by other levels of government. And certainly the mayor at the time, Jim McGee, was very vocal about that. And just going back to the civility, he himself was, a victim of, well, what would you call a community member throwing an egg at your face at a council meeting, just to reflect on that. It's just unacceptable, and it compromises democracy, which is counterintuitive, I would have thought, to what some of these groups are demanding their rights. Well, being part of a democratic system doesn't involve that sort of behaviour. But going back to the cost shifting issue, it is a significant issue for councils. I think it's something that the state government really struggles to understand because the financial modelling of councils is not a uncomplicated system, and not a lot of people understand it.
I'd agree with that, Kathryn, and I think Glen Ira is certainly to be commended for that work, and Jim McGee particularly there for being a great spokesperson for the sector, I think, on this issue. But there have been some other situations where I think, not to put too fine a point on it, but where councils have effectively had to stare down the state government and say, we can't carry this burden any longer. And some of them are, more significant than others. But, one example, Strathbogie Shire Council decided that they had to exit school crossing supervision. Now, Strathbogie has 5 school crossings. It's not an enormous service by any means, but they were having to fund the entire, 60% of it, I think they said they were paying. And yet that's a state government responsibility, is school crossing supervisors. And so for decades, Strathbogie, like councils across Victoria, have just been picking up this funding gap because that's what their communities want. Strathbogie said, we can't continue to do that. And so eventually the state government and Strathbogie got talking, and now there's a funding arrangement. So that's a good outcome. City of Yarra did something similar about cleaning and maintaining state roads that run through the municipality. And eventually the state government had to come to the party and come to an agreement about that. And I think we're going to see more and more of that unless something fundamentally changes. More and more councils saying, we simply cannot take it any longer. We have to make some really tough choices. And unfortunately, when you make tough choices, people lose out.
What else do we think might happen in the next term of council? Quick crystal ball gazing prediction, Kathryn?
Look, I think we'll see probably many more candidates than we've seen before stand. And I think there's some questions around the motivation behind some of those candidates, although anyone, of course, is eligible to, oh, not anyone, if they meet the criteria, are able to put their hand up. And I think, we will find the reforms that are currently being implemented more important to get right. And I think the work that the VLGA does and others like us in the sector in supporting councils and councillors to deliver the best outcomes for their community through good governance and leadership will become even more important.
Well, I think there'll be 78 councils who will enjoy the wonderful induction that's been delivered to them, partially by the VLGA under the new reforms. They'll come together as wonderful teams, and they'll work constructively and effectively for their communities, and we'll solve the financial sustainability crisis somehow. I'm an eternal optimist, Chris. I don't know how much of that comes true, but if even one of those things comes true, I'll be pretty pleased.
I think that's a really positive note to end on. Thank you, Rhys, and thank you, Kathryn. Lovely to have you back on VLGA Connect, and let's hope we'll see you a bit more often in the next term of council.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. I'm looking forward to getting back in the seat.
Excellent.
And
Kathryn.
might I say, Chris, just before we wrap up, since we are doing a bit of a retrospective, just thank you to you for your role that you've played in pushing the message of local government and talking about some pretty important issues. I think obviously the focus on Victoria, but bringing the Victorian ears and audience to an international audience and exposing us here in Victoria to news from right across Australia and across the world has been really useful. And thank you for that contribution that you've been making, and may it continue.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yes, let's hope it does continue. We'll do our best to keep fighting the good fight. Thank you, Rhys Thomas and Kathryn Arndt. Lovely to catch up on this special edition of TGU from VLGA Connect, sponsored by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers.